Welcome to the Stephen Mansfield Podcast.
Welcome to the Stephen Mansfield Podcast. Let me ask you very quickly before I dive into the second part of a two-parter that I'm doing here to go on to iTunes, find the Stephen Mansfield Podcast, and write a review. You say such kind things in emails and in feedback, and when I meet some of you at the events that I do around the country, and I just want others to be able to access those comments and be able to be drawn in to the discussion that we're having in this podcast. So please write a review for the Stephen Mansfield Podcast on iTunes. Now, in our last podcast, I was talking about the radical middle. I was saying that I am not afraid of political conflict. I am not afraid of these government shutdowns that have an over budget. It's the way the founding fathers designed it. They believe that men are corrupt. They believe that men will dominate each other. They wanted conflict set into the system. They wanted separation of powers. They wanted a power of veto. They wanted consensus to win and for people to have to debate and come to conclusions. And so I was talking last time about how I find myself constantly slightly right of center in American politics. And it's not because, I'm just a weak personality and, the old joke, there's nothing in the middle of the road except dead skunks and yellow lines. I know, but that's not why I end up there. I think about my principles. I think about what I believe, and I end up somewhere just right of center on most issues. Now, there are a few issues on the American spectrum of political life. I end up further to the right. For example, I'm stridently anti-abortion, except in a few cases. And I feel very strongly about that, very, very, very fiercely about that, because I believe that an abortion is a taking of a human life. And by the way, I think it's also anti-women. On the global reach, most of the children who are aborted in the womb are females because they're considered lesser. Certainly, that's been the case in China. And so I think it's an anti-feminist, anti-woman issue. I also think abortion's the taking of a human life. So these are positions I hold very strongly. Some of them land me further right. But for the most part, I find myself in the middle. And in American politics, I find that most people who are outspoken in American politics are abandoning the middle. I mean, if you look at Fox News and you look at MSNBC, I've been on both. I'm not criticizing them, but MSNBC is pretty far to the left for the most part, and Fox News is increasingly moving to the right. And so where's the middle? Where's the voice for the middle? CNN ranges in there somewhere, depending on what the issue is. But most Americans, surveys show, are slightly right of center. I think we live in, as George Will, the Washington Post columnist, has said often, we live in a center-right country, and that's where I find myself. So it's a strange kind of place to be, because I'm not there because I'm constantly triangulating political opinions. I'm not there because I'm constantly reconciling two opinions who have been handed to me, because I'm not courageous enough to take one side or the other. I'm there because it's what I genuinely believe. For example, I absolutely believe in a free market. I think we should have a free market. I think it's the engine that has produced most of the prosperity in the world. I think everyone in America should be allowed to achieve, to own a business, to start an enterprise of some kind. I don't think there ought to be any bias in that. I believe in that. However, I do not believe that we ought to be living in a state, in a country, in which corporations have blended in and merged in with the apparatus of the federal government or state government. In other words, I don't think we ought to be living in a corporate state. I think private ought to be private, and it shouldn't be funded by the federal. In other words, have a business, grow a business, let it become large, but let it not take on the authority of government, let it not become enmeshed in government, let it not buy its way into government. The very definition of fascism is that the state and large corporations merge and basically represent each other's interests. I'm not in favor of that kind of thing. Why? Because I believe in a free market. Because I believe that when you have fascism, when you have the state and the private corporations blending together and serving each other's purposes, and the one being bought by the other, so to speak, I think individual freedom diminishes. And I believe in individual freedom above just about everything except morality when it comes to public life. So So do I believe in a free market? 100%. I want to see more industry. I want to see more innovation. I want to see more creativity. I love the stories of rags to riches. I love the ideas of Booker T. Washington and others and the businesses they inspired. I love seeing industry and people arise. I love knowing some of my Vietnamese friends whose parents literally arrived as boat people, but now have risen by running markets and doing good things, not by blending in with government authority and going a political route and gaining benefits for themselves. No, by working hard, by earning, by paying taxes, by being American citizens, and by achieving. And they've achieved magnificently. But again, I say that doesn't allow me to go hard right wing. That allows me to be just slightly right of center, believing in a free market, but wanting checks on corporate power, wanting for the corporations not to own politics, not to own government, wanting to keep them separate. And by the way, wanting corporations to pay their fair share of taxes. I'll have to say that one of the areas that I kind of sound maybe perhaps right-wing, when in fact I'm actually relatively moderate, is that I think we ought to have a flat or a fair tax. I don't understand why we don't. The fact is that if we had a flat tax of, I'll just put a range in there so we don't have to debate the details. Let's say 10 to 15%, and all people paid 10 to 15%, and all corporations paid 10 to 15%. We would have government would take in more increase. It would take in more money, and most people would be paying less taxes. And you want to talk about stimulating the economy, if there's any truth at all to the idea that more money in the hands of individuals to spend in the economy, generates creativity, generates innovation, and creates a better society for all, then one of the best ways to do it is to have a flat tax. So, in fact, I got to tell you, most people could end up with a 20% tax rate. They would cut their taxes, and the government would take in more money. So here's a situation where, again, I want individual freedom. I want fairness. The idea that Bill Gates can complain and other Warren Buffett and others can complain that they actually pay a lower tax rate than their secretaries do is just immoral. Again, is this hard right wing? Is this hard left wing? Have I become a socialist? Have I joined Karl Marx? No, I'm in the radical middle. Let's have fair across the board taxes. Let's have individuals paying taxes. Let's have corporations paying taxes. Why in the world in America does the NFL, the National Football League, how in the world do you get away with the National Football League not paying taxes? Come on, that's crazy. That's crazy. Somebody bought themselves a privilege. And while I love football and love it at the college level and love it at the pro level, and if you know anything about me, I'm a crazy Notre Dame fan, and I helped to a very small degree chaplain the Redskins, and I'm a crazy Washington Redskins fan. The fact of the matter is, I think the NFL should be paying taxes. How did they become a nonprofit corporation, for heaven's sakes? They're not a church. And so it's not radical hard right wing or radical left wing for me to say that. It's just common sense. So we could have a fairer tax system in America by actually charging most Americans less tax, but by having an across-the-board tax rate. It's unbelievable that there are wealthy people who say, quite frankly, I didn't pay any taxes last year because I had businesses that went under or because I did other things, and somehow I ended up paying actually no tax. When the average American is paying somewhere between 20 and 40% of their income in tax. The average American is paying somewhere between 20 to 40% of their income in tax. Now that's unnecessary. It's unnecessary. Certainly not when the NFL is paying no tax at all. So what I'm commending here, what I'm trying to deal with, what I'm trying to talk about is the fact that the middle has been abandoned. And that people on the left and the right, the talking heads on the left and the right, talk about the middle as though it's the place for scaredy cats, as though it's the place for people who don't know what they believe, as though it's the place for people who just can't seem to come to an opinion. Well, I have very clear opinions I'm strongly in favor of, opinions that I'll speak to anytime, opinions that I believe in. And they didn't come by reconciling left and right. They came, I hope in every case, by looking at what was moral first. In my case as a Christian, yes, what's biblical? Moral and biblical are almost the same thing for me. And And at the same time, looking at what's common sense, like the flat tax situation. That's not taught in Scripture. Morality does not inherently suggest that, except that morality does suggest that our taxes ought to be fair and that we shouldn't be punitively stealing from some while others escape having to pay their fair share. Again, the example of the NFL being tax-free organization. So consider this in your politics. My point is not to lead a movement. My point is not to pull people away from what they believe politically. My point is to say that the reasonable, thoughtful, not going to be smeared by labels, slightly middle of the roads, in my case, right of center, this is where the action is. This is where the creativity is. This is where things are happening. This is where ultimately the wingnuts end up. You can scream all you want on a Fox or an MSNBC or a CNN show, and that's fine. But ultimately, when it comes down to governing, we have to come to some reconciliation. We have to contend, but eventually we have to synthesize. Eventually, we have to come to ideas that work. This is what great statesmanship does. This is what it means to be thoughtful. This is where America is. And as I've said many times, and I said it last time in this podcast, as George Will of the Washington Post is often reporting, we are a center-right country. That's where most Americans land. And I think we ought to consider the virtue of that and that it's given us many of the gifts that we celebrate as the gifts of America. So maybe we need to pull in a little bit from the extreme left and the extreme right. Maybe we need to ponder a little bit more the virtue of ideas that we've labeled left and right wing. Maybe we need to see that there's a blend of the two, and maybe we need to reclaim the radical middle in American politics.
Stephen Mansfield is a New York Times best-selling author, a popular global speaker, and senior fellow for public leadership at Palm Beach Atlantic University. His groundbreaking books on faith and society include The Faith of George W. Bush, The Search for God in Guinness, Mansfield's Book of Manly Men, and Lincoln's Battle with God. Learn more at stephenmansfield.tv.